Was Inspiring Philosophy wrong about biblical slavery? So if you don't know, Inspiring Philosophy is a Christian philosopher and apologist who recently was on a podcast with someone to talk about biblical slavery. I would definitely encourage everyone to check out this podcast. I think he does some good things. I think he makes some good points and quotes some interesting scholars to back up his case. Part of his argument in this video is that the Bible was used to engage in abolition, and so it would be strange for a book that was used to engage in abolition to in fact promote the very thing that is attempting to be abolished. He also talks about a little church history on the subject of slavery and quotes scholars noting the fact that, Christians made a lot of headway when it came to abolition. Now, firstly, I want to say it certainly is true that Christians were abolitionists. A lot of them were in the 1800s, and it was often because of their interpretation of the text. But I think this argument is flawed, and part of the reason is because of the connection that is made between the abolitionists and the Bible. We know for a fact that the slave owners and the abolitionists were actually both misinterpreting scripture for their own rhetorical goals. In this Black History Month series, we've already talked about the curse of Ham in Genesis chapter 9 and how the slave owners dealt with that, and we talked about Leviticus 25. As I mentioned in a previous video, Leviticus 25 became important for abolitionists because this is the passage that talks about the year of Jubilee, where in ancient Israel, certain slaves were to be freed. But notice the caveat there, it's certain slaves. The abolitionists use this to make application to them and their situation. The problem is that in ancient Israel, the year of Jubilee would have only applied to debt slaves. It doesn't say anything about child slaves, which is mentioned a few verses later. And if the Mosaic Law says something about sex slavery, then the year of Jubilee would have had no effect on a sexual slave unless that sexual slave was there because of debt. So saying that it's weird to use a book that condones slavery as a means of liberating slaves and using that as a sort of argument to defend the Bible and what it says about slavery seems to fail because it does not recognize the fact that both sides of the discussion back then were misinterpreting scripture. Obviously one side more than the other, but still. So I've done a lot of research on biblical slavery, and so the question of whether or not the Bible, as in these 66 books, all condone it, or what you do with all that, I think is a little complicated. But I don't think this podcast does a great job of getting to that either.